Hi, I'm James Gardner, host of Your History, Your Story, a podcast for everybody who loves stories about interesting people and events told by those who uncovered them from within their own family trees. This, we hope, will inspire you to discover and celebrate your history and your story. On June 29, 1933, at the Garden Bowl in Long Island City, New York, an imposing 6'6" Italian boxer named Primo Carnera knocked out a smaller but highly skilled and more experienced Jack Sharkey to become the world heavyweight boxing champion. Primo was born in 1906 in a small village in the northeastern corner of Italy. A large baby at birth, Primo continued to grow at an alarming rate, and by the time he was a teenager, towered over his family and all the other residents of his village. Eventually, he was asked to leave his home because his parents could no longer afford to provide the food necessary to satisfy his ravenous appetite. After setting out on his own, Primo worked odd jobs, and after a while found work as a circus strongman in France, where he was able to earn a living, eat well, and grow even bigger and stronger. While performing as a circus strongman, 22-year-old Primo was discovered by a boxing promoter named Leon C., who had been told of Carnera's enormous size and incredible strength. Thus began Primo Carnera's professional boxing career, which would take him across Europe and to the United States, where he would earn the nickname the Ambling Alp, and would go on to win the world heavyweight boxing title a little less than 5 years after his first professional fight. He would also accumulate a record-setting 72 wins by knockout. In this episode of Your History, Your Story, we will be speaking with Primo Carnera's granddaughter, Ann Hibbets. Ann will share family stories about her grandfather's life, including his early years as a hungry teenager, his incredible boxing career, which included bouts against such greats as Jack Sharkey, Max Baer, and Joe Louis, and his acting career, which included small parts in movies such as The Prizefighter and the Lady and Mighty Joe Young, in which he had a tug-of-war scene with a giant gorilla. In this heartfelt interview, Ann will explain that despite her grandfather's enormous size, physical strength, and knockout punch, he was really a gentle giant who loved his family and treated others with gentleness and kindness. I'd now like to welcome Ann Hibbets to our show. Welcome, Ann.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we're honored to have you. I want to start off with this question, Ann. Where were you born and raised?
I was born in Southern California, and I lived there till about 12, and then we moved back to Circus, where Primo was from, lived there for 3 years, and then went back to Illinois and finished out my college there.
Okay, so Circus, Italy.
Yes, Circus, Italy, I'm sorry, yes.
Oh, no problem at all. So, Ann, this podcast is about Primo Carnera, who was the world heavyweight boxing champion from June 29th, 1933 to June 14th, 1934. And in my opinion, that was like right smack in the middle of the golden age of boxing. I mean, there's so many greats in that period.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
He was also about 6'6", 6'7", and in his prime, about 265, 270. He won more fights by knockout than any other world heavyweight champ in history. That's quite an accomplishment, wouldn't you say?
I agree. That's pretty amazing.
So, Ann, how exactly are you related to Primo Carnera?
I am Primo's granddaughter. My mother was his daughter. He passed away a year before I was born, but my mother and my grandmother, his wife, Pina, kept his story alive and his spirit alive and told a lot of stories about him, and they were very proud and loved him very, very much.
So can you tell us kind of approximately when you had an idea of who your grandfather was and the famous person he became?
For the true appreciation is that when we moved back to Circus, Italy, which was his hometown, and people knew my mother. My mother had grown up there, and yeah, I'd go to the market and people would stop me on the street and say, "Oh, we know who your mother is, and we know you're her daughter, and we know who your grandfather is, and this we're so proud of him, and we remember him." And it was just that people would come up and remember someone who'd been dead at that point, passed away at that point by 13 years or whatever. But he just lives on in Sequoia. The older generation above me, remembered what a nice man he was. Such a gentleman, they would say. He was just a wonderful person. They were more proud of that, I think, than the title. The title was very important. Obviously, it brought a lot of attention to Italian American sports, but they just really liked him as a person.
That's good that you got firsthand, really comments from people who had met him and actually knew him. You mentioned your mother and your grandmother talking about him. Do you remember any of the stories that they shared about him? What was he like as a person? Did he have a sense of humor, gentle spirit? What was he like?
One of his nicknames was the Gentle Giant. He was always known as, even if you go back and you look at some of the writings or some of the information about him, they always referred to him as just this kind person. Loved his family very, very much, and always, I guess, had a kind word. Definitely just loved children. He would, where there would be crowds, he'd get off the train and in Milan or Rome and to go home, and in the crowds, he'd find the children and he'd pick them up and he'd put them on his shoulders, and just, just a nice, gentle man, even though he was, someone that boxed and then wrestled. And those are both very powerful sports, but personality wise, out of the ring, he was just a kind person. That's all I've ever heard, and that's all I've ever read.
Now, I remember seeing a little newsreel of your grandfather bathing. It was either I guess your uncle or your mom as a tiny baby, and he had these gigantic hands, and he was washing the baby with such gentleness. It really took me, really. I thought, wow, how's this gigantic man moving this little baby so gently around? Did your mom have any specific things about her dad that she really felt strongly about? Any strong memories that she had that she shared with you ever?
Oh, she was definitely a daddy's girl. She had a lot of memories, and obviously being their daughter, all the fabulous ones, but she didn't realize really who he was until she grew a little. And as a young child, she didn't know, but she loved her father very much. And when they were together, she was, and her brother Umberto, just the focus. When he came home and he was with them, he was just dad. She adored him, and from what I can tell, he adored her too.
Well, that's very nice that you have those memories in your family and that those memories are passed down to you. And let's go back now. Let's go to Primo's early years in Italy. So you said he was born in Sequoia. What part of Italy is that?
That's in northern Italy. It's north. Let me do my math. Northeastern, close to what used to be the Yugoslavian border.
Is it a beautiful area?
Oh, gorgeous. Your backdrop is the Alps and meadows, and it is a beautiful area. I haven't been back ever since then, but I do just remember coming from Southern California, the LA area, and you go to this beautiful, wide open space, and the town was wonderful and just quaint. Everything was just really adorable about it.
Oh, now, do you know anything, or was it ever passed down to you, his early history? Why did he leave Sequals? How did he become a boxer? Do you know that story?
Yeah, I do, and it's a story that my family's always been exceptionally proud of, because it really can tell you the type of person he was. He was born in Sequals. He was the first son, so his name was Primo, and his brother was named Seconda, which meant second. So
Oh, really?
His dad were just pretty, black and white people. So he's number one and number two. He was 22 pounds when he was born.
22 pounds. He's already a halfback.
Yeah, and he grew up very quickly, and he became. His family was my family, my great grandparents, normal size. His brothers were normal size, but they were people who worked. At that point, they didn't have a lot of money. His father worked at like quarries and with stones, but money was tight. And his memory, and what my grandmother always told me, is he grew up hungry constantly. He didn't have enough food to fill his body. So honestly, his parents said, I think he was 14 or 15. I can't remember the exact age. And they said, listen, we can't afford to feed you. We can't, and you need to go out in the world and make your own way. And, when we think back at today's age, you can't imagine, sending your child out. So he traveled to France and found a circus, and he became a strongman in the circus. And he also did wrestling on the side, which was kind of the foundational for when he went into wrestling later on, which kind of after his boxing career, it was kind of like a little light bulb moment of, things he could do, because he was very successful there. He was found by a promoter at the circus, and that's kind of how his story began. And that promoter said, with that size, we can make a boxer out of him.
That's interesting. I think about running off and joining the circus. We joke about it, but it was real. It's something that, I mean, he was a great candidate for the circus as a strongman, that's for sure.
Yeah, and he was able to, once he joined the circus, he finally had enough food. And when he finally had enough food, he actually grew more. So he became larger and he became stronger. He wasn't just this person who was hungry and wasn't developing as a normal nutritional guidelines. But once he was able to eat during his time in the circus, he did expand on his size and strength.
I've seen photographs, and for those of you listening on our YouTube channel, you'll see photographs of Primo. He was like the ultimate physical specimen, absolute ultimate physical specimen. And I can imagine how much food it would take to feed him. Really, just a huge man. But so he would also do some wrestling as well. Was it part of the circus thing, or was it like a side gig?
The little that I know about that component of it was another way to make money. You'd wager and, just like betting on it. So it was another way for him to bring some money in. From what I can tell, or what I've heard, is he won all the time, but strictly because of his, his size. There wasn't really anyone in Europe at that point that could match him size-wise.
Yeah, I wouldn't think so. I've read a few statistics, but a couple things I read said like the average Italian adult male in the early 20th century might have been about 5'5", maybe 5'6" at the tops, and he was well over a foot taller than the average man. So he must have just really stood out as a big guy.
In any photograph that you see, he's always heads taller than everybody else. If I think about, you do look at him and how he looked, I mean, muscle wise and body structure wise. And I always wonder if he had take him and put him in today's conditioning and today's world of how to, physically, the exercising and the regime and the nutrition and everything, what he would have become, or how much more he would have become.
Yeah, I definitely think of that. That's because, it was a hard life back then. I mean, your grandfather was born in 1906. Again, he didn't really know where his next meal was coming from, probably when he was initially starting off, until he found that at least the circus gave him a structured environment where they needed to feed him. But yeah, so you can imagine if he had really good coaching and good nutrition and good conditioning. Wow, he would have really been amazing. But he was amazing even without modern training when you think of it. So in 1930, at age 24, Primo moved to the United States. What caused that, and how did he adapt to his new home?
the promoter that found him, and these are some of the details, I bet you even know more specific details and names and dates, but the promoter at that point, he had done some boxing in Europe. They started him out there kind of to see what he was like, and kind of get, he's just starting as a boxer, and started on some basic training of how to work in the boxing ring, and period, just how to box. Once he'd had some foundational work done there, then they brought him over to America to start small and work his way up as a boxer. He was a simple man. I mean, to really honest, he came from a small town. He was a simple man that, and I don't mean simple as not smart. He was a smart man. He spoke 3 languages. He was just, someone who was very trusting also. So he was brought over, and he was, from what I know, and from some of the stories my parents told, terrified, obviously, but excited. I mean, he's got this opportunity that you never would have dreamed of. So he was excited when he came over, and was excited. He trusted the people around him and was looking forward to a great career.
Now, when you say trusted, that sort of brings me to my next question. Some have said that Primo, there was some mob involvement with some of Primo's fights. What are your thoughts on those allegations?
Honestly, there probably was some things around him. I mean, at that time period, I want to say the mob or people, people would take advantage, and they knew they could make money in certain ways. And again, he trusted. And I know that my grandmother told me at one point that, he was sad. I mean, he truly was very sad when he realized what was happening. However, he was a big man who could land a punch. And he was a fighter, and he had the ability to win. And so, I believe some of the stories, but I also believe that he was a good fighter in his own way. Mm-hmm. He may not have been graceful, but he was a big man, and he had a strong punch. So I think there was, I'll agree that there was some involvement at some point. I don't know anything specific, but I do believe he was a good fighter. There's a story with his fight with Max Baer. He went, I think, 11, 13 rounds. He took hit after hit after hit, but he kept getting up, and he kept fighting. He refused to just quit. He refused to throw in the towel. But that's tenacity, and that is strength of character. That's not somebody who's there to throw a fight. That's somebody who's there to win a game, to win. And he stood on his own 2 feet as long as he possibly could. And Max Baer did give him quite the pummeling.
And yeah, he did. We're going to talk about that in a second. Often when you hear about mob involvement with Carnera, it's more that the fighters that Primo was up against were some of them taking dives or falls or whatever, so that there could be bets won and careers advanced and money made in the mob. But Primo, from the videos I've seen of his fights, he's giving it all. And as you pointed out, 2 things. One, with his size and his reach and his power, all you have to do is let your guard down 1 second, and you're on the canvas. You're down, because he was just a powerful man. But he could also take the hits as well. Mm-hmm. He didn't have what I guess they call a glass jaw or anything like that. He was a powerful guy, but it always looked like he was giving it his all. Now, in one case, in 1933, your grandfather, Primo, got into the ring with a boxer by the name of Ernie Schaff. And it was a sad outcome to that fight, but it kind of shows that Primo could hit, and could hit hard. Could you tell us a little bit about that event?
Unfortunately, after my grandfather did hit him, he like you said, he put his guard down for a moment, and he did get hit extremely, extremely hard. And he passed away a few days later. And my grandfather never recovered from that. That I know for a true story. It was told to me by my grandmother and my mother. And they said he was never quite the same, because you have this man who again, gentle and kind, who truly believed that that blow that he dealt was the end that caused Ernie to pass away. Um, so, it was a horrible thing. It was a horrible situation. And, he truly never recovered from it. I remember my grandmother said he had nightmares for years. He'd wake up, you had this huge man who'd wake up in pure sweats and tears. And that went on for years. So yeah, he took it very personally, and, he continued with his career, obviously, but as a person psychologically, that was a big deal. And, back then there was no psychological counseling or anything. In today's day, it would be very different. You'd have somebody and he'd be able to talk to someone, he'd be able to, try to work through all that. And that's just, a guy in a ring who thinks he killed a man and then had to live with that the rest of his life.
Yeah, that must have been really tough on him because I've seen films of that fight, and in the beginning, if I recall, right after Schaff was knocked down and out, your grandfather looks around to like see is he okay.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, he celebrates because he's won the fight, but you could see he was worried about, are you okay? This is about boxing. It's about a sport. It's not about trying to maim or hurt somebody for the
Mm-hmm.
sake of hurting them. It's because it's an athletic event. You could see the concern on his face, but then again, his livelihood now was boxing. So here he is. He's a contender, and he has to keep boxing in order to live, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in 1933, your grandfather went up against a boxer by the name of Jack Sharkey for the World Heavyweight Championship. Can you tell us a little bit about that fight? What was the outcome?
Well, yeah, the outcome was, he beat Sharkey and he took over as the world heavyweight champion. And that's first Italian American heavyweight champion in the world. And that was a huge thing for Italian Americans or any Italians. My grandmother had a box full of letters that he would receive from around the world about how excited they were that, that they looked up to him. He won that match, and there was talk about, was this match fixed? However, there's an article that was written, an interview with Sharkey, probably 10, 15 years later. And the interviewer asked him dead out, did you take a fall? And Sharkey was, when you read the article, adamant that when Primo hits you, you go down. He said the man's punch reach was amazing. He said, why in the world would I throw away my belt? He hit me hard, and I lost fair and square. So to hear that Sharkey adamantly said it was a fair and square fight, really, to me personally, kind of solidifies the fact that that belt was real and truly earned.
It would have had to have been a big payoff for him, as you said, to sacrifice his championship status. Mm-hmm. And I've seen videos of that fight as well. And Sharkey got clocked. he got hit hard. So for almost a year, your grandfather was the world heavyweight boxing champion. So, as you said, he's representing Italy, Italian American. So, what, to your knowledge, obviously he passed away a year before you were even born, but from what people told you about him, how did he handle that fame during that year? Do you know?
I don't know much about that time period. Obviously, he was very excited. I know that when he would go back to Italy, he was overwhelmed he didn't think he was all that. These crowds would come and see him, and they'd want to touch him, and they'd want to, be near him, and they'd shout his name, and he'd get off the train and you hear Carnera, Carnera over and over again. And he still stayed humble, though. He wasn't a proud man in regards, but he stayed humble, and it was a new thing for him. And I can't even imagine what that would be like for a man from a small town who was sent away by his family to come back and have your name chanted wherever you go and to be recognized. And he's very recognizable. You can't really miss him. So it's not like you slide into a restaurant or anything. There was a story about he met my grandmother and they went out to dinner. They were sitting by the window and people just kept knocking on the window. And my grandmother was a very strict, how do we put it? Very, very, I wouldn't say uptight, but she looked at him and she was like, I don't think this is going to work. I can't do this. And he said he picked her up and he moved them to the back of the room. And, she had some transitioning to do. She had to understand it too. But yeah, it was a life-changing event.
Yeah, particularly for a humble guy.
Yeah.
So in 1934, we started to talk about it, and on June 14th, your grandfather lost the title to Max Baer.
Mm-hmm. And
Max Baer, some people may know Max Baer both from the Cinderella Man movie, the role the actor in that movie that played Max Baer came across as a really sort of a nasty, mean person. That's at least the feel you got from him. He was somebody that wasn't very nice. Mm-hmm. But in reality, that is far from the truth. From what I understand about Max Baer, he was a very, very nice man. And he actually became friends with your father. But in the fight in 1934, Max Baer, he beat your father. And I think he actually beat him up pretty badly, because I saw there's a picture of your grandfather lying in a hospital bed, it looks like. Mm-hmm. And Max Baer was visiting him in the hospital. Yeah. Do you know anything about that relationship between the two men?
Max Baer completely respected my grandfather for what they went through for that fight or that bout. They became friends for years. For years, he would go over to my grandmother was an amazing cook. They'd go over and sit with my grandfather. And as far as I know, all I've ever heard is what a nice man he was and how he was a good friend to my grandfather.
Yeah, and if I could pick two boxers from a bygone era that I would like to sit down and talk with, they would be Max Baer and your grandfather.
Oh,
because I just think they are just interesting men, tremendous warriors in the ring, but that have big hearts, big guys with mm-hmm. big hearts, and that's the way I think of both of them.
As far as I can think about Max Baer is he had a persona he had to play. It's part of the game. He made himself renowned for being aggressive but underneath, which my grandfather never did. They approached boxing from different ways. My grandfather never tried to come off as aggressive, but I think Max was just this nice guy underneath. I don't think my grandfather would have been friends with him or had him over for dinner if he was just kind of a jerk to him. That's just one of those things he would do.
Definitely. So I understand that Primo had an acting career, and actually he acted in a movie with Max Baer called The Prize Fighter and the Lady in 1933, and the movie that they made together was really it was the year before the fight that they had. So here they are, they're acting together. They probably were friendly at that mm-hmm. time, and they got into the ring, and of course, all bets are off in the ring, and once the gloves are on, it was all business at that point in time, but they were friends. Can you tell us a little bit about what you know about Primo's acting career?
He wasn't the best actor in the world. I can tell you that. But I think he was a unique person. He was an interesting person, but I don't know a lot of specifics about how he got the roles, but I do know that he was friends with Bob Hope, and they acted together in a period piece. I have pictures with him with the Three Stooges. I don't know if he was in a movie with them or that was just happened to be a fun thing they did. So I think it was just something he did for fun. I've never heard that his big dream was to act for the rest of his life, but he, again, how do you come to think about a simple man coming from a small town, and now he's in Hollywood and he's friends with a famous actor. It's just, talking about a Cinderella story. It's an amazing story.
Yeah, you can't make that up. That's why I'm so glad that we're having this conversation. By the way, the movie The Prize Fighter and the Lady, one of our previous guests on our podcast, her name is Cora Sue Collins. And as a little girl, she acted in that movie, Prize Fighter and Lady, and she remembered your grandfather. She had told me, he seemed like a very nice man. Of course, she was very little at the time, but I'm sure she probably got that gentle giant feel from him.
Yeah, my cousin is older than me, but she remembers being a young girl, and she remembers just putting her hand in his hand, and she remembers his hand and how huge it was. That she just this little hand in his big mitt, and very gentle though. She remembers the same thing too.
And I know another one of his nicknames was the Ambling Alp.
Mm-hmm.
So as you said, they could see the Alps from Sequoials. So that's how we got that name. But one of the photos you sent me was your grandfather standing next to Charlie Chaplin.
Yeah. He was also in King Kong. He was one of the strongmen in King Kong trying to fight. He was one of, a bunch of strongmen that were playing tug of war with Kong, and they lost.
Was it Mighty Joe Young?
That was
Yep.
it.
Yep. Well, it was perfect. No, so I think about probably like Charlie Chaplin and the Three Stooges are just great photo shoot opportunities to have this giant guy and these little men. It was a good sort of a comedy picture to have. So Primo's boxing career started to drop off a little bit, particularly after his loss to Joe Louis in a later fight. His boxing career just was not going up and to the right anymore. He also, from what I understand, had some health issues that may have affected his boxing. Can you tell us about that, Ann?
Well, what I know is that he did start to step away from boxing. He went back home. He went back to Circus. He lived in Primo Carnera, and he lived there with his family. And he needed some time is what he needed. And I think, especially with my grandmother saying, this isn't what I want to see anymore in your life. I have heard that he developed diabetes. I don't know where that developed in relation to him going back into his wrestling career. I don't know if he was battling that at the same time or if that came afterwards.
Yeah, so he was having some issues with things that were caused by diabetes, whatever the effects of diabetes were affecting his fighting and maybe his training. You mentioned your grandmother before, and her name was Giuseppina. Is that how you say it?
Yeah, Giuseppina. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, they married in 1939. They were married 28 years when Primo passed away in 1967. And by 1939, Primo's boxing career was phasing out. But during that time that they were married, you mentioned he went into wrestling. He did some wrestling. He was pretty well known as a wrestler. He probably drew a lot of people, a lot of crowds, would you say?
Definitely. I know that somehow at the end of his boxing career, he wasn't left with a lot of money. People took advantage of him for what he had gone through. He should have been set for life for what he accomplished. But all said and told, in the end, he ended up, not with a lot of money, and he had to make a decision on how do you continue supporting your family? How do you consider, and wrestling, going back to his thoughts on, what he was doing with the circus, kind of developed some ideas, and wisely so. I think as a wrestler, his body type and it's not as violent. I think Giuseppina was happy with that. She was much happier than having him, punched in the face all the time. And
Yeah.
It just seemed to be a better fit for where he was with his life, where he was with his body. Your body is wrecked, it hurts. And wrestling was just not as it's a physical sport, but I think it was something that was more manageable for him.
Yeah, I would think so. Now, during their 28-year marriage, did they live mostly in the United States?
They split their time. They had a villa back in Italy, and then they had a home in somewhere in Southern California. Both my grandmother and my mother went back and forth quite a bit.
When your grandfather was age 61 in 1967, he was very, very ill, right, at
Mhm.
that time. And from what you had told me in a previous conversation, he wanted to go back home really
Mhm.
to die. And when I say home, Sequals. Could you tell us about that?
By the end, he was a very, very sick man. You could look at him, you could tell he was a very sick man. They were in California at that point, and he wanted to go home, literally to die. He wanted to go home. I have a photograph of my mother hugging him at the airport, and that's them saying goodbye. And it's a heartbreaking photo to look at. But he did go home, and he passed away there, as was his wish. And I think, as much as if we all get that opportunity to choose where and be happy and peaceful and with the people that you love around you, I'm very glad that he was able to do that.
Now, you mentioned that you did live in Sequals for a little while. Did you
Mhm.
ever visit his grave there?
Yep. He has a mausoleum. So my grandmother's actually buried. She'd passed away in America when I was living in Italy. And so they brought her body back and she was put into the mausoleum with my grandfather. It's not fancy. It's kind of him. It's a little mausoleum, and it's in a cemetery where it's not ostentatious. I think his brother might be in there too, but it was just something simple, just like him. He didn't, it was just an opportunity to have his wife close to him. And you walk into the cemetery, it's not like it jumps out at you. It's just over on the side.
It's good that he was able to get back there in time and be where he
Yeah.
wanted to be. We've talked about Sequals a little bit already, and really how important Sequals was to your grandfather. As far as Sequals today, what does Primo mean to Sequals today, from what you know?
They celebrate Primo still. They are proud to have been his birthplace. They are proud that he built his villa there. My grandmother had sold the Villa Carnera, which is that was a beautiful home in Sequals. And she sold it in 1971, but it went into disrepair after. So I think in early 2000s, the town of Sequals decided that they wanted to revive it. So the town purchased the villa. They have refurbished the villa. I've not been back, but it is beautiful. It is a museum. It is a museum to him. And what they like to do is celebrate boxing. I guess every year they have a boxing tournament where they invite all the boxers from Europe, and then they come and they have a wonderful, award ceremony there, and it's all under my grandfather's name. So they still remember him and they still celebrate him, which is wonderful. And I think I told you once is you don't really truly pass away until the very last person forgets you, or does it last person knows you. And he's living on, and they're going to tell their children. They're very proud, and I think he would be so happy just to be, again, and they're proud of him and they remember him as just this amazingly kind guy who happened to elevate Italians in the sporting world.
And even though you never met your grandfather, how does it make you feel that his home village of Sequals continues to hold him in such high esteem? It must make you very proud.
It's like you said, I didn't know him. It's a unique feeling, but I I have his bloodline. His blood runs through me too. And just his story, the whole story from the very beginning to the very end, I think is fascinating. I think in my life I promote kindness. It's very important to me, and maybe I got that from him. I don't know. And he's remembered for all the most wonderful things. I'm very proud of that.
And you should be, definitely. And what do you think Primo would have wanted his legacy to be?
I think he'd want it exactly as it is. A man, a nice man who won an amazing title, and yeah, I think he'd be pretty excited and happy with how it is right now.
Well, he was certainly a humble man from everything I've heard about him and read about him. And just the fact that the town of his birth just honors him. And even though he had only 1 year as the world heavyweight champion, it was more his big heart and how he treated other people that was the biggest part of his legacy, really. And I think that's a really nice thing to hear about somebody who's your grandfather. It must be a great honor to you to be able to say that Primo Carnera was your grandfather.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Now, how about the rest of your family? How do they feel about being descended from him?
Um, they're teenagers, so they're a little self-involved, but they are they love the stories. We have posters of him. My son went up to college, and he brought two framed beautiful posters. He's very proud to tell everybody who his great grandfather is. As they get older, I think they'll understand more. I tell them the stories because hopefully they'll tell their children the stories. These are the things that you hope, as they used to tell, as history used to be told, it was told from generation to generation, generation. So, I tell the stories all the time, and I remind them of, when things are tough or they're having, struggling with something. And I'm like, you need to think back about how hard it was and how your great grandfather got up and kept going and did the right thing. So you've got it in you, just like I've got, his bloodline, so do you. So, and they actually, it's a really good connection for them. They take a breath and then they go, okay, if this amazing story happened to my family, I can do it. I can step up. And, it's that's the nice part to see, that you have someone who they've never met being affected or making their own life decisions based on the legacy that he has left.
The legacy of your grandfather is just something that, for your family, that's fantastic. As you said, his blood runs through your veins, their veins. But I hope that this podcast the people listening to it will start to look up who was Primo Carnera if they don't know him. Maybe if you're a boxing enthusiast, that you know who Primo is, or you've seen the Cinderella Man movie, and there's actually an actor who plays Primo briefly in a fight scene there. But for other people who may hear this who may not be a boxing enthusiast, to really research him a little bit and find out who he was and his journey and how he really had a tough time. To have to leave home because you're hungry and they don't have enough food to feed you, and then have to earn a living and then come to a foreign country and learn another language. And let's face it, he was a big, huge guy and he was in great shape, but he was getting hit by the best of the best.
Mm-hmm.
He was taking big hits, and he had to take it. And of course, he had health problems too, and he probably had to fight through a lot of not feeling well and things like that. But I think you should be very proud of him. And I hope that this discussion will spark some interest in other people to learn more about Primo and other people in history
Mm-hmm.
who really had to work hard. Even though, there's little things about the mob involvement, all that. It's like, people trying to take advantage of somebody who was just an amazing person who trusted them. That's the story. And again, I hope this is a podcast that does justice to you and your family and the memory of your grandfather.
Thank you. And I want to make sure that I am crystal clear that my grandfather earned that belt fair and square. He did, and it was recognized. So any of the doubters, anyone who would say anything negative about that, no, he earned that belt.
I'm not a boxing expert, but I read Sharkey's article. Very, very, very sincere from the way I read it, that he lost to your grandfather fair and square. And I've seen videos of the fight, and I'm with you on that one. I really am. That he earned that title. I want to close with a little coincidence. Your grandfather passed away on June 29th, 1967. and he won the World Heavyweight Boxing Champion title on June 29th, 1933.
That's amazing.
History has those little coincidences. Anyway, Anne, I want to thank you for being a guest.
Oh, thank you for having me. Thank you for letting me share his story.
And it's an honor, and I hope we can keep in touch.
Thank you.
And thanks again. Have a great evening, all right?
All right, bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Your History, Your Story. You can connect with us on Facebook and YouTube at Your History, Your Story, or on Instagram and Twitter at YHYS Podcast. We'd love to hear from you if you have any questions, comments, or a story to tell. Be well and God bless.